Hello everybody, this is RodLab video tutorial lucky number 13. In this video I'm going to talk a bit about the new features in the RodLab Beta 4.3 release. And if you're wondering, and maybe been counting, you might wonder what happened to Beta 4.2. Short answer is I created a release package working on the documentation, and as I was doing that I thought of some better ways and less confusing ways to handle some problems that I was thinking about. So with that I put 4.2 on hold and created 4.3, so there's no public release of 4.2. At the bottom here we've got a link for the two-handed software homepage. I'll put that in the video comments so you'll easily be able to surf over there, and let's do that now. So here's the RodLab homepage. Down at the bottom we've got the RodLab Beta 4.3 install files. If you click on pop out, it's probably the easiest way. It'll open the files in a new window. You can download them there. First I want to talk about the release notes. Biggest change and probably the most interesting is I've added user support for specifying your own rod materials, which would be density and modulus of elasticity. So you could add your own, be it green heart, whatever type of bamboo you want to use, maybe fiberglass, whatever. You can go ahead and put that in the program yourself. We'll talk about that obviously more. Added support for a round cross section. Added a Morgan hand mill setup report. And big thanks to Tim Anderson, who shared his spreadsheet with me that hopefully gave me the right ideas. We'll talk about that more in detail. Added some visibility for the column rounding numbers and user control of those. Back in Beta 4.1 we added column rounding. Now you can make changes to that yourself and see how it would affect the taper. Added some quick rib setup shortcuts in the taper translation. Added shop tools with support for calibrating V-blocks and some minor bug fixes. We won't talk about those in detail. One thing I guess I'll mention real quick that some stuff about manual taper entry has been cleaned up, although it's probably still not perfect, and also some stuff with how single piece rod ferrules are handled, so that should be a little cleaner. So let's head over here, and before we do anything and open up RodLab, I want to show you in the past RodLab had these folders. It had a tapers folder and a G-code folder. I've added a new folder for export files. Materials, when you can export your own material. Same thing for guide sets. Export and importing will be handled through this directory. Be an easier way to get at it. So we'll talk about that in a bit. So let's go ahead and double click on RodLab. And you notice first thing it tells you it failed to load the material config. You've probably seen this type of stuff before. Anytime you've got a new installation, it has to create some configuration files. In the past we didn't have material config. If you saw this kind of warning when you've been running for a while, that would tell you maybe there was some file loss or something odd had happened. But for now, for the first install with this version, it's expected. So let's go ahead. I guess first thing we'll do, let's just quick open shop tools here. This is the Vblock Calibration. So I've got hex, and I probably do more rectangular and quadrate than anything. So when I pull this drop down, that'll give me my V-block angle. This drop down for the drill rod size will give me the rod diameter. And that will give me my expected gauge reading on my caliper for that rod size and that V-block angle. Now you don't have to use mine. If you have your own custom V-block, say a 91 degree V-block, and your own drill rod that you want to use, wrong number. There we go. You can just enter in your own and it'll give you the caliper reading, or the caliper reading, the desired or expected reading, so you can calibrate. That is something I do a fair amount, and I always have my sheet. I can never find the darn thing. It's buried under something, so I have to do the math every time. Kind of a pain in the butt. So let's open the config window. Oops. Let's close this and then open the config window. There we are. And as you can see, I've added a new configuration path for that export files here. It comes up right in mine. You'll want to double check as always that these paths are correct. For whatever reason, the Windows interface that I get these from, it's right most of the time. Every so often it's wrong. I haven't figured out why. Let's go over here to report. As you can see, I've got a checkbox for create Morgan hand mill report. So if that's checked, you'll get your Morgan hand mill. Over here, I've got the different material configs. I'm not going to talk about this in detail right now. The reason for that is it's a fairly complex topic. It deserves its own video, and it's probably something people will refer back to more than once. So we'll put that in its own video. While I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and import. I mentioned I had those export files. I'm going to import a couple. I'm going to grab some green heart, and let's just grab a node list. So those have been added to my material list. So let's close this out, and let's open a taper translation window. And just for consistency, I'll grab my Dickerson 8013 And as always, the first thing I like to do is just calculate the new rod over the old rod. And you may have noticed here that some things are different. In order to get everything in, I had to move some windows around. So the calculate new rod button is up here. The output information text window is up here. My new rod notes are up here. And just moved around slightly. Not a big deal, I think. A few things that are new. Here's my ability to change my material. So right now I'm on Tonkin, and I've got my column diameter here. Let's go ahead and play with that first. So let's say I've got a magic 6-inch diameter column. I've never seen one, but they probably exist somewhere. And if I had that, you'll see that I would get a little bit smaller of a rod cross section, and the reason for that is I would have less rounding with that bigger column, and I would have less missing bamboo, if you will, or better quality bamboo in there. Now if I were to take a bigger column, 1.5, or a smaller column rather, 1.2, and you notice that 0, the station 0 basically represents the butt of the column, the ground of the column, and the 12-inch would correspond with what goes in the tip of the rod, or which would be higher up in the column. So if I calculate that, you'll see I actually get, because I've got more rounding in that cross section and I'm missing more bamboo, I get a little bigger cross section in the output rod. So let's clear that out. Let's just recopy it and calculate again. And I'm going to come out here, and when I write my G code and reports, remember I check the Morgan hand mill output. So when I do that, I get this Morgan hand mill file. And let's come in here, RodLab G code. I'm going to delete these out. These are older. So here, first things first is my MHM report. And again, thanks to Tim Anderson who gave me his. So here's my settings, and one thing that's new here, it's new for my planing report as well. I added a strip width. My strip width does not take into account the rounding of the column. I figured this would be something that would be more something people would use as a indication of how close they're getting to their height, where height is really the important factor and width is less important. So this is just the ideal height without column rounding. And you can see your settings here. Again, I've never owned or operated a Morgan hand mill, so I think this is good because, as I mentioned, Tim Anderson gave me his setup sheet and I worked off of that. There may be some things that are incorrect here, so before you build a rod, please double check. And let's come back in here for my planing report. In here I've also got a strip width as well. Otherwise, no big changes, and the strip width and height in both the Morgan hand mill report and the planing report are adjusted for the wet cut factor. The final rod dimension values are not. I'm assuming you're going to dry it out before you assemble it into a rod. And let's come back here and do a little bit of material spec. So coming back in here, again, new rod. I've got the same rod, so that's exactly what I wanted. I just copied everything. Let's grab Greenheart instead, and let's grab a round cross section. And what you might notice is when I grab Greenheart, my column diameter gets grayed out. It's not active anymore. So because of how I would expect Greenheart to be cut from a board, so you wouldn't have any column rounding. So that's why that is engaged and doesn't have any effect. So if I calculate a new rod, here are my Greenheart with a, let's go ahead and save that off. So this is what a Greenheart rod would look like if I wanted it to be a Dickerson 8013. And I can go ahead and save that out. There we go. And one thing that I mentioned a little bit, I've got these shortcuts here for ribbing. Now this is a solid file, or solid taper, so I don't have any ribbing here. So let's make a hollow one. Let's just recopy and go back to my base 8013. And now let's hollow this out. 20 thousandths at the tip, 50 thousandths at the butt. There we go. And when I do that, you'll see I've got a little bigger taper. When I come in here, I've got my guides and my ribs. And all that I've got, all these shortcuts are really for is I can hollow without ribs, and you see it just automatically does the settings to take those out. I can hollow with manual ribs, so basically more ribs, full height, or fewer ribs, full height. Or I can hollow with CNC ribs, and in this place, when I do that, I end up with some binding dams, I end up with some smaller ribs. So just basically a quick way to do a setup, and then after you do that setup, you can go ahead and modify everything how you want. I've done a few changes here as well. I've got the rod config. These are all things that I think you're going to want to change, or at least potentially change for every rod. The CNC config window, these are things that you probably set up one time for your process and you most likely don't change them after that, maybe a little bit, maybe not at all. And then the plot config window is the same thing. And what else is there? I think, that's pretty much it for this report. So let's get out of here and just do a quick bending comparison. I got some warnings because I've got some different materials in here. That's really something we'll talk about in the future. Let's just grab my 8013 and my 8013 green heart. There we go. And again, you see they, as expected, they bend pretty close together. One thing you can do, since we got materials up, let's just go ahead and do this. I'm going to add an analysis taper. Let's take the green heart out of there. And let's do a double build. And let's come in here. And for material, I'm going to make this a double built 70,000. So all that means is I've laminated a 70,000 strip of bamboo on the outside of a column. And let's see what the difference in that looks like. Really not that much different. It actually turns out for the 8013 that the mass increase of the double building makes it a little bit slower of a rod. It's stiffer on the inside, but for this particular taper, the 8013, it looks like double building with 70,000s is not a great idea. So let's come in here, instead of a double built, let's look at a nodeless construction. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that the nodeless is something I used, I think it was Millward's book, to come up with some expressions for how much stiffer a nodeless cross section would be. I don't know if it's exact or accurate. It looks roughly correct. So if I go ahead and do nodeless, you'll see I end up with a little bit of a stiffer rod. It's not a ton stiffer. I've heard people say that nodeless is equivalent to decreasing the line weight by 1. So let's go ahead and do that comparison. And you see if I do that comparison, let's just do 2. Millward's approximation that I use gives me about half of that. So it's more like about a half a line weight stiffness increase. That may mean that somebody else was a little wrong when they said that nodeless is about 1 line weight increase. It may also mean that Millward's numbers are a little bit off. I'm not sure. This is something that maybe we can come back and evaluate later with some people who are building nodeless. They can give us some better information. So I think that's where I'm going to end it here. The next video we're going to talk a bit more about rod materials. It's a fairly healthy subject in how you would enter your own and how to use it. So thank you for listening, and I'll be back.